This is the PR Podcast, a show about how public relations helps you tell your story to the world. We talk with great PR practitioners who have the skills, creativity, and just plain savvy to get their clients noticed. Now here's your host, Jody Fisher.
Hey, everyone, and welcome to the PR Podcast. I'm Jody Fisher. Thanks for joining us. Well, you've got to get yourself a PR podcast plug. You know, they come in drips and drabs, right? Every once in a while, I get one. And I like to say that PR people are really good at promoting their clients, but they're really bad at promoting themselves. At least I am. And so I wanted to create something here where it makes it really easy for us PR people to just pat ourselves a little on the back. So send us your PR podcast plug. Now, what is a PR podcast plug? It's your side hustle, right? It's your thing that you do because you love it. It's your passion project. It's your blog. It's your website. It's your TikTok channel. Maybe you play the guitar. Maybe you, make pottery. I don't know, something off the beaten path of what you do in your 9 to 5, right? Send us a note to the PR podcast. Send us a DM. Let us plug your passion project in an upcoming episode of the PR Podcast. Now, you come here for guests, and we got one for you today. Let's get right into it. Darrell Pressley is principal of the Pressley Media Group based in Baltimore, Maryland. As a journalist, he covered crime, politics, education, and breaking news in the cities of Detroit, Cincinnati, Boston, and Kentucky. You think this guy's been around? I think so. Today, he works with clients providing story crafting, media outreach, and crisis communications with writing that is thought-provoking, emotional, and authentic. Music to my ears. Darrell, welcome to the PR Podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
So you and I have nearly identical backgrounds, right? Reporters turned PR guys. What makes a former reporter a good PR person in your estimation?
I think it's the understanding of both sides of the table. One, you understand from a media perspective, from a journalism perspective, what a reporter is looking for. When they're asking the particular questions that they're asking, you know exactly the direction that they want to take a story. You also know when they're asking questions, the questions that they didn't ask, you kind of know, well, you know what, they probably have that answer to the story. That's one side of the table. The other side of the table is then being able to translate that information to your client, to your principal to say, hey, I try to give people a 3-picture window. They're asking these questions, they're going in this direction. The headline is going to look like this, it's going to look like this, and here's how we want it to look. And then we give that opportunity to our principals to remember we're working with the opportunity to decide which direction that they want to go with the goal of controlling the narrative. So I tell people in the work that I do that there are 3 keys to communications. Number one, it's all about making connections, connecting the right information with the right people in the right place at the right time, in the right way, and for the right reasons. And in today's world, it's all about right now the right reasons. If you look at the news, there are good reasons and bad reasons. There's positive reasons and negative reasons why people are getting information out. The key number 2 is to have a clear, concise, and consistent message. And for me, what I tell my principals or my clients, that message has to be authentic. And what I just talked about at the very beginning, the key number 3 is to not let anyone else tell your story. Don't let the media, don't let your competition, don't let anyone tell your story. You do your very best to control the narrative. So that's really what I'm focused on, is to be able to provide that information, provide that context, provide that picture, that landscape for people. And being a former journalist, and you know what, I tell people, once a journalist, always a journalist. So as a journalist, here's what I think we are facing, and then here's how we control that narrative.
You are preaching to the choir here. You are saying things that literally I have said word for word.
That's that, and you know what?
Absolutely.
When you did the introduction, it is very hard for me to put my arm around Therese to pat myself on the back. I'm so focused on, elevating people. And when you talk about yourself and the work that you do, I've had to make that transition now to really focus on the introduction. Thank you so much for that. For the last 10 years, I've been a spokesperson in the District of Columbia government. So crisis communications, that media communications, all of that is really what I've been focused on for the last 10 years. And now I decided, well, before that, with COVID, that it was time for me to really reach out and help businesses. What I saw was there were so many businesses around me in the Baltimore area that were closing, that were shuttered based on COVID. And I said, you know what? Let me take that side hustle and turn it into a full-time public relations firm focused on helping all types, all sizes, all shapes of businesses, because I understand what I tell people, it's not rocket science, but there is a science to it. And
Yeah, for
if
for
you
sure.
understand that science, then you can use it, you can leverage the media, you can leverage communications. It's when you don't understand that science that people kind of fall short and they get themselves, unfortunately, into situations that they need folks like us to kind of help them get out of.
Yeah, you mentioned that special skill of being able to think like a reporter, and we have that skill because we used to be reporters, and
That's
and
right.
I like to tell people that I still have that reporter DNA. I never leave because that gets in you. That doesn't go away.
It doesn't go away. It
It's
doesn't go
right, it
away.
does not go away.
You know, you
So
watch,
so
you see something in the news, you kind of go, oh, you know what? If I covered that story, I would have done this, or, I would have written it that
or
way.
I I find myself, reading the story and I always go, okay, what's day two? What's the day
Yes.
two story?
What's
Where
the
does the
next
story
day?
end up in 5 days? Or I'm thinking, how is there an opportunity to inject my client into this story? Does it make sense to put them
Yes.
into this story on day two or day three? Or
Yeah.
how can my client help in this situation, perhaps, if there's something, there's either a tragedy or someone needs assistance, or do I have an opportunity here? And not in a selfish way, like to get publicity, but to actually help, right? And then because good deeds create good press and good PR, right? Because then it gets reported, but it gets reported for the right reasons.
Right.
Talk a little bit more about thinking like a reporter. I know it's sort of one of those things. It's almost like playing the guitar. It's like well, you don't know what you do. You're just doing it. And when you sit back and then you got to sit back and think about it and explain what you're doing. So maybe if we could take a minute, sort of explain how we think like reporters.
It's just the understanding of how to elevate people, how to leverage stories, how to understand the direction of a story, how to get out in front of a story. What I've been focused on with my messaging in terms of clients is three P's now. I love alliterations. And it's to protect, promote, and position companies. I work to protect their brand. I protect their reputation. I promote their products and services. And I position their, which is what you were talking about, their leadership as thought leaders in their industry. And the only way that you can do those three is if you have that understanding of what's a hot story, what's a sexy story. Like you said, how can I inject a thought leader into a story that's happening right now, that right now immediate story? Because when you're a reporter, you're in the moment, but you're also at the same time thinking about that next day story. You're looking, already advancing that very next story. Or you see an issue and you want to get out ahead of it. You want to be the first to really hit that particular point of a story. So it's really that passion and that love for the written word, and it's that passion for really telling a story. And that's really what it's all about at the end of the day, with when you're trying to protect a company, promote a company, or position a company. It's telling that story. In a crisis, you have to give that other side, that other perspective. When you're promoting, you have to tell why this company is the best in the business. And the position, again, trying to position a company to say, hey, this is a thought leader. This is an innovative company. This is a company that's on the cutting edge. And so you're always looking for that story. And a quick example, I was talking about the COVID-19. In Washington, D.C., I worked at the Department of Forensic Sciences, which was at the time the lab on the Hill in DC, the nation's capital, that was doing the first COVID-19 testing. March 3rd, 2020, I will never forget it, was when we received the first positive case of COVID-19 in the district. So while everyone else was hunkered in, everyone else was quarantined, I was going into the laboratory providing the mayor's office with the numbers of how many people were positive, how many people were negative, how many people were hospitalized, and providing that information. And what we did was we positioned this little lab on the hill as one of the leaders in the battle against COVID-19 because they were forward thinking. They acquired the technology ahead of the testing, and they mobilized their people. We don't know what this is, but you know what? We need to start getting our hands around all the information that we can. And wow, do we have the technology? So right before we had that first positive, they called it a presumptive positive. They had already acquired the technology, already had the staff geared up. And then that very day, we had a news crew come out to the lab. And then later that afternoon, we got that first positive test. So that's really what it's all about, understanding that the timing is now to get out in front of a story. And how can I elevate and position this laboratory with all the other laboratories, the private ones, the public ones across the country? How can I elevate this one as being the forward-thinking, innovative laboratory? And that's exactly what we did. But that's only because you understand that science that I talked about in terms of reporting and having that journalist eye. Last thing I want to add, one of the things that happened when we had a crew come out, an actual television crew, was that I noticed as they were actually in filming that all of the scientists were women. So I leaned over to the reporter and said, "You notice that there are only women in this laboratory. That shows you something about this lab." The next thing you know, she focused that for her story, and then it became a national story on NBC about not only their women, but they were Latino women. And so we had a double a double hook that led to a national story. So that's really that, again, understanding at a journalist, right in the moment, the heat of the moment, to knowing that and seeing that eye and say, wow, that's another story on top of a story.
Yeah, that's a special talent. Not to pat ourselves, as you said, too hard on our backs, but it is something that we are trained to do as former reporters, as you know, when we train to be reporters, to be observant,
Yes.
to look around and look at things through different lenses, or to look through the lens of the way the reporter is looking at it, or the way an editor is looking at it, taking into account things like schedules and staffing and what's going to happen on Thursday, and how do I tell this story to my audience,
Yes.
and picking out the whole thing there that you just said. You've got a medical story, you've got a crisis story, you've also got a story about women. You've got a
Mhm.
story about the Latino population, right? So
Yes.
you've got multiple stories, multiple audiences is what I'm
Yes.
hearing there, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
this is not just a story necessarily for the NBC nightly news, but this is also a story for Spanish language publications and women's publications and scientific publications. And now you're branching out into all different types of niche areas with just that one
Just that
story.
one story. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that
That
was
that to me
that
is the magic of what PR people can do.
and there was magic there and you could feel it, but you never do that as a journalist. You never think about that end game and that, wow, this is going to be big for what we're trying to do. You're in the moment really trying to help your principal, and at the time it was the Department of Forensic Sciences and the laboratory and the scientists, the incredible scientists that were actually to tout them, risking their lives. They had live virus in that laboratory that they had never seen and experienced before, and wanted to tell that story about how they were dedicated to helping the District of Columbia residents.
That's terrific story. That's just wonderful. Let's pivot a little bit here from the magic that we create, because
Okay,
we don't want to kiss ourselves too hard in the mirror, to
there you go.
some misconceptions, right, about what we do. And sort of when we work with clients, clients come in the door and they have all different types of ideas about what we're supposed to do for them. And ones who are a little more savvy understand the difference between, let's say, PR and advertising or marketing, right? And understanding that public relations. And when we talk about PR, we're mostly talking about media relations. There are other publics that we talk to too, but let's just boil it down to media. Are there ways that you help to inform or program clients to say, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to work together? Because what I find is that some clients, depending on their experience, or their understanding of what we do, or their expectation of what we do, might be like, well, sign the contract and go ahead, get me in the newspaper. And they're not actively engaged.
Well, you have to get them engaged, and that is the challenge for a lot of the work that we do. I try to use a funnel that really kind of educates and gets both of the jobs done that I have to do really at the same time. One of the things that I talk about when we initially engage, I do it's like a three-step process. The first step is to actually say, here's what I can do to help you. But then I need you to help me to tell your story. And so we really break it down into what is the issue. We then talk about what is the message. So here's the issue. What are the messages that we want to get out? The next thing we talk about is who is your audience? Everyone wants to say, just as you said, I want to be in the New York Times, I want to be in the Wall Street Journal, I want to be in the Washington Post. Well, who is the audience? Once you discover what the audience is, then you have to find out what I refer to as the communication channels. Well, where do they get their news? Is it social media? Is it the Wall Street Journal? Is it television? Is it radio? What is the best way to get that information out to them? Then we talk about the frequency. How often do we get that message out? And then the last piece is we measure. So I go through that entire process so they can see what the input they need to give in order to make this happen, and then what I need to do and the information that I need to make all of that possible. The audiences are really key for me because, again, everyone thinks that you can just automatically pick up a phone and you can automatically get into the New York Times on the front page. No problem. But if we don't know our audiences and how we reach them, the New York Times may not be the place to go. It may be that local newspaper. It may be social media. For millennials now, their appendage is a phone. So social media channels are really the way to go for millennials. One of the things that we also do is we talk about multi-generational communications. That means that there could possibly be, I'll go back to this laboratory. We did the research and there were 5 generations in that laboratory, which means there are 5 different ways that they want to receive their information. The baby boomers want to sit face to face. They want to have a conversation. Millennials want to have really brief, short conversations. They got it. They're gone. They're ready to go. My generation wants to have a conversation. We like to pick up the phone. We like to actually walk down to the office and knock on the door and say, hey, do you have a moment? If you don't understand that language in terms of that messaging, you run into problems. So we have to go in through some of these processes to get them to understand. Once they get it, then we're gone and we're ready to go. But I think one of the keys is that audience understanding that it's not always the Wall Street Journal, it's not always the New York Times, it's not always the Washington Post, that you need to get that message out through that channel. You have to figure out who your audiences are and those channels where they get their information. And then you
Yeah,
have to, from there,
for mainstream news, I find it's rarely big outlets like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal that move that needle, that it is more often that more local or more closely adjacent audience.
and as a reporter, I worked for the Boston Herald, a nationally recognized newspaper, the Cincinnati Enquirer, a nationally recognized newspaper. But let me tell you, when I was an education reporter, I looked at those small town newspapers to get a lot of the news because they are living and breathing those stories. And oftentimes they're breaking stories that it takes them to do before we can find out what the actual stories are. Then we have to go in and do our work. But that local news, that local newspaper, and today with social media, today with online newspapers, could be the chamber, it could be a blogger who has information that you need to be aware of, that then you can take that to the next level and write a story on a larger scale. But that local content sometimes is the best way to go.
Yeah, my favorite client request, new client request, is we need to be out there.
Yes.
And I say,
Yes.
okay, let's focus that a little bit.
Yes, let's talk about that. What is
What do we
that?
define as out there?
Exactly.
But in all seriousness, let's talk about, what PR eventually does for a client, right? Because, you can have the ego hit where it's like, oh, you got quoted in the article, you got this feature thing, and then you're in the newspaper or the publication that's most important to you, right? And you cut it out and you frame it and you hang it on your wall. I call that a moose head.
Mm.
What are some of the more, most important things that PR can do for a client, and what maybe some examples of what you've done, placements that you've done for a client or something that has actually moved their needle in the way they wanted it to move. Do you have any examples?
I worked for a group that was trying to, uh, they had their charter school, right? And they were trying to keep their charter. So in DC, you get a charter, and every 5 years, you have to go back and resubmit your application to actually keep your charter. So this was a school that had that 5 year point where they had to go back to their board. They had some issues, and the board was saying you have to meet this criteria in order for you to get your charter resubmitted. Well, we did community outreach. We reached out to parents. We reached out to folks in the community and say, hey, let's galvanize around this charter school because it is important for this community. And here's what we need to do. We need to write letters to the board. We need to have meetings and get that parent support so the board understands how important this community charter school is. And without this charter school, we don't know where our kids are going to get their education. And so we did that groundwork. We did that campaign. We refer to it as a campaign and reached out to the community. And then we also wrote letters for parents. We did it in several languages. We gave people the elevation that they need to be a voice. And I think really when it comes down to a lot of the work that we do is giving people a voice. It's giving them the opportunity to really tell their story, which is part of those keys that I talk about, a clear, concise, and consistent message. And one, again, that's authentic. And so we work with parents and we allow them the opportunity to have their voices heard. And in education, I'm a former education reporter, that's the biggest thing, is for a parent to be heard. You don't always have to agree with them, but they just want to be heard. And that community outreach, that groundswell, is really what turned the tide for that charter school. And they were able to regain their charter. But it was because when that meeting was held, the room was packed with parents. They had already received dozens of letters from the community supporters, community advocates who were saying, we need this charter school. We need to keep the doors open. And that's really what it's all about. The Washington Times, the Washington Post, the NBC story, those are beautiful. And I love those, and those are great opportunities. But it's when you take a company or you take a school or whatever it is, and you give them the opportunity to really tell their story and have their story heard, and you do something positive for a community or what have you, that's really what it's all about. And I love that aspect of it, is really helping to tell that story for people and giving them a voice when otherwise they weren't able to do that.
You have put your finger on what I think is the reason that we're here,
Absolutely.
is to help people tell their stories and to navigate a space that maybe they're unfamiliar with, but that can help them tremendously. And if nothing else, we are guides through that wilderness, helping to connect them with the people who will help them tell their story and get that word out to the audiences that they need to reach. Because of something like you just described, this is not just selling a widget, right? PR is not just, selling t-shirts or something. This is, we can, depending on the business that we're in, and I do a lot of work, nonprofits and others, where this is very, very serious work because they help a lot of people who need help, and they need people like us who can guide them in helping create that effective message and get it out to the right audiences.
Right. And just to add on to that,
Yeah.
I tell people that priority number one for me is internal communications, which we were talking about the newspapers and television, but that internal communication goes a long way for any size company. The internal communications is priority number one because you have to tell that story to your internal people. I have a theory called the allies adversaries theory. And that means that whatever size company you are, if you don't do that groundwork on the inside and tell your story and give your message and show your people the value that they play in the roles that they play in your company, you can quickly turn an ally. And I refer to your internal staff as your ambassadors. You can turn an ally quickly into an adversary because they don't see the value. you have a merger and an acquisition, you're having layoffs, there's a contract, a multi-million-dollar contract that's kind of in limbo right now, and they're reading all of that in the newspapers. They're reading that in the papers that you want to get your story out to, but you aren't talking to them on the inside. They're worried about their jobs, they're worried about their 401ks, and that's when you see or read or hear the New York Times or CNN has just received this leaked document, and that's based on not doing that internal communications first. So I truly believe that priority number one is internal communications. Once you get that message, then the external work is easy because you've already done the groundwork. And so when you're dealing with an unfortunate thing like a crisis, you've already have your messaging because you've already talked to your people. Your ambassadors are going out in communities all across everywhere. And if you're international or if you're mobile, they're talking all over the world about, hey, there was a crisis, but the internal people, our leadership told us that everything's going to be fine. We're not going to lose our job. Our 401ks are safe. They're really working hard to help our customers. They're going and bending their backs. They're going backwards out of their way to help us. So everything is fine versus, man, I don't know what's going to happen to my 401k. We can't go to the Bahamas like we used to. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow because every time I read a newspaper, it's something different. Imagine that conversation versus what I said previously about, hey, everything is fine. And I believe that you can pivot, you use that term, I'll use that term as well. You can take a negative story and turn it into something where you leverage it to show that you are in control of a situation. You can turn a negative story into a positive story. I believe there's only one type of negative story. That's either one that you didn't have the opportunity to tell your side or give your perspective or your narrative, or you did and you chose not to. That's really the only negative story. You can take a bad story and turn it into something that's positive in the fact that you are able to establish your narrative and tell your story.
Yeah, you put your finger on it. I don't know creates an informational vacuum.
Yes.
And you and I both know that vacuums in the news business get filled by
Yes.
whatever will fit into it.
Yes.
So if you're not telling your story, someone's going to tell it for you and insert their version of your truth into that vacuum. And now you got a problem.
Right. And we use the term, and this, I tell clients that I use the vernacular we use in the newsroom. You're giving that story legs. You're giving that story oxygen. And so let's try to take that oxygen. Let's try to take those legs out of a story by giving our narrative and telling our story. That's the most important thing when you're dealing with both a positive story. You are announcing a new product, and your competition is announcing a product. You can say, we're the best at this because, and you can give your narrative, as opposed to a reporter saying, hey, your competition just released this. What do you have to say? Oh, no comment. You can say, hey, that's great. We're excited for them. There's room enough at the table. Let's talk about our product. And we think that our product is really good for this clientele because, and then you can tell your story and you shape that narrative, and you don't give the competition the opportunity to tell your story for you.
That's exactly right. That is exactly. Well, that's a great place to end up this conversation here, Darrell. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. We're going to segue into the rapid fire question portion of our podcast here, where we steal a page from inside the actor's studio. Maybe I'm dating myself with that reference at this point. I'm not sure. Maybe I got to switch the script up. But you know how this goes. We ask you a series of rapid fire questions meant to elicit a simple 1-word or 2-word answer, maybe a laugh or two. So with your indulgence, Darrell, here we go. Rapid fire question number 1. What is your favorite news source?
The Washington Post.
Love it. Rapid fire question number 2. What's your favorite social media platform?
LinkedIn.
Oh, all right. Yeah. LinkedIn growing in popularity. And give us your quick answer about why you like LinkedIn.
You're networking with like-minded companies, like-minded businesses. They're all looking for connectivity. Again, I said the key number 1 is about making connections. And from a business perspective, LinkedIn does that for you.
Good stuff. Rapid fire question number 3, coffee or alcohol?
Coffee.
Rapid fire question number 4, your favorite on the run food. Give us some Baltimore flavor here. Come on.
Oh, some Baltimore flavor is a hot dog on the run. You can have go to a gourmet van in downtown DC and get a hot dog, or you can get a sandwich at one of the vans that are outside downtown. So a hot dog or a sandwich, a quick sandwich is a way to go for me. Keep me moving.
Sounds good. And rapid fire question number 5, Darrell, what do you want to be after you finish this career?
I want to be a DJ.
Ooh,
I love creating beats. And with the technology now, you're an app, you can be a novice and get an app on your phone and put some beats together. So I want to be a DJ.
some of the best TikTok channels, and I'm just
There
getting
you
into the TikToks,
go.
are these guys doing the beats. And there's this one guy, I'm gonna mess up his name. It's like DJM Beats or something like that. But he
That's
does
right.
like this Saturday morning 80s playlist, and he's terrific. I love it. Every Saturday morning. I'm like, yes, I'm on there. I'm listening. He's wonderful. All right. Well, Darrell, thank you. This has been a great conversation. Please let people know how they can find you and your company online.
You can find Pressley Media Group at PressleyMediaGroup.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. You can find me also on Twitter, PressleyMediaGroup.com.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Darrell. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Please remember to subscribe to the show. Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at the PR Podcast, and send us a question or comment. Our intro is by Christopher Appold. You can find him and his fantastic photography on Instagram at Christopher_APPOLDT. Check him out there and hire him for all your photography needs. You can find me online at Jody Fisher on all of the socials and on the web at jodyfisherpr.com. We'll see you next time on the PR Podcast.